What we'd like to do now is to try to process the film through some questions with a panel, and we are very grateful to have an esteemed panel with us today. I'm going to start to my far left with Dr. Gerardo Marti, who is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Sociology at Davidson College, right down the road. He's also the president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion and the president-elect of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. His book, The Deconstructed Church, Understanding Emerging Christianity, co-written by Gladys Gunnell, received the 2015 Distinguished Book Award from the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Dr. Marti's most recent books include Latino Protestants in America, The Glass Church, Robert H. Schuller, The Crystal Cathedral, and the Strain of Megachurch Ministry, and most apt and relevant to our discussion today, his book, American Blind Spot, Race, Class, Religion, and the Trump Presidency. Currently, Dr. Marti's research is funded generously through the Lilly Endowment's Thriving Congregations Initiative, which is focused on researching progressive churches actively confronting racial justice. So let's welcome Dr. Marti to our panel. These are both also close friends of mine, so I just want to say a word about Dr. Marti. You saw a lot of folks in this documentary that are sociologists of religion, and I just want to be very clear that Dr. Marti is as esteemed as all of them. You're lucky to have him here. But Andrew Whitehead and others on there are close friends and colleagues of Dr. Marti's, and so we're really fortunate to have him here to speak on these issues together. Also excited to have Dr. Lucretia Berry, who is the founder, president, and president of the learning community at Brownicity, which was launched in 2015 with the purpose of making important scholarly informed anti-racism education accessible to all people. Dr. Berry earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction from Iowa State University and is an anti-racism curriculum specialist, course designer, and the author of a number of books: What Lies Between Us, Fostering First Steps Toward Racial Healing, Hues of You, an activity book for learning about the skin you are in, and Teaching for Justice and Belonging, a journey for educators and parents, co-authored with Tia Starker Glass, which is her newest book. Let's welcome Dr. Berry to the panel. And just as a note, as a friend, Dr. Berry has been an incredibly important partner with us in the work we've done with Confronting Whiteness, serving as an accountability partner with us, holding our facilitators accountable for our own anti-racist work as we go through the journey of facilitating others on their journeys as well. So thank you, Dr. Berry, for being here. Thank you, Dr. Marti, for being here. Let's start with a softball question. Is America a Christian nation? Two-parter, second part. What role does this argument play in American politics? We'll start with you.
Okay, America is not a Christian nation. I mean, we all know from basic history lessons that, and they mention it in the documentary, that literally people were coming here to flee religious tyranny and intentionally wrote in very important documents that a religion would not inform law and how we live. And then, of course, we have the freedom to worship and practice whatever faith we feel is best for us. Now, there are lots of Christian, I will say Christian principles or beliefs or ideas that that impact or are part of how we live, how we practice life, and how we do and what we do together. But those that type of wisdom, those good ideas, like, well, we shouldn't just randomly kill people, those kind of great ideas extend beyond Christianity and are not exclusive to Christianity. And so what was the other part of it? Sorry.
What role do you think this argument of saying America is a Christian nation, how does it function and play in American politics?
Well, I mean, it's exactly what the documentary points out is when I will say in a lot of American churches or in the tradition of the American church, conditioning people to a blind faith. Kind of turn off your brain when you walk into the to the door, when you walk into the double doors, and in a submission to a particular authority or an authoritarian type of way of living that is so ingrained and so much a part of the American Christian identity. So then it becomes an easy tool for politicians or any kind of divisive entity to use to signal, to dog whistle, to get people, to rally people to a particular side, to quicken an urgency. So if you, of course, come to church or go to church weekly, and that's something that surrender, turn off your brain, it's good to submit to an authority unquestionably, and that's a part of your practice, then yes, you are ripe and ready to be inspired and motivated by a nefarious entity. I'll just stop there.
I'm so glad to be here. And I'm proud to be associated with a church that's willing to engage with these issues exactly in this way. One of the things that's lost about early American history is the actual debates that happened among Christians about whether this actually was a Christian nation or not. There were religious bodies that said it's impossible for this country to be Christian because Jesus is not in the Constitution and slavery is. There was a lot of discussion. Certainly we had a Christian world, but it was multiple Christian bodies at war often with each other and really struggling. What strikes me about whatever Christian nation we may have had is the amount of violence that was legitimated and thought of as absolutely correct. And one of the things that I learned as I really spent time thinking about this is when the New World was discovered, you had soldiers and you had priests. And they were two different kinds of people who came on these boats to come to the New World. But by the time that the Puritans came, the Puritan came with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other, and combined both. That's what we've struggled with, I think, in the United States. And now that we've come to this point in time, it's the revivalism that lies at the root of this Christian political commitment. In order to be the right kind of Christian, you are inspired to vote in a particular way, to take on particular attitudes about policy, and to think about different people in certain ways. And so if there's something that's weird about this whole thing is how often I've been asked as an expert, what's the biblical view on fill in the blank? And wow, there is so much anxiety among a good portion of the Christian world that tries to make sure that they have the right biblical perspective. And there are many, many churches, people, parachurch organizations, and especially politically funded and politically directed organizations that are more than willing to tell the world what the proper biblical view is. And it takes a tremendous amount of confidence for a person who desperately and earnestly wants to be a good Christian to say, I don't know, is that really true? It's much easier to say, yes, I want to honor God, therefore, this is what I must do. And the voter guide becomes an act of discipleship. I think that's important.
Wow. I appreciate you, Dr. Marty, drawing upon how Jesus is not in the Constitution, but of course slavery is. And I think that the line, a through line through the whole film is this question around the history of slavery and segregation and racism in general in American history. So a couple of the things that I thought were interesting in the movie that I didn't know when I watched it the first time were that the KKK at their height numbered 8 million Americans in 1924. But now, and the whole point of the movie is to try to show these connections. And now, Christian nationalism, though, accounts for about more than 30% of the nation, which is about 116 million people. So if you think that starts with the KKK and leads to Christian nationalism now, boy, the movement has grown. Wow. KKK, small percentage. Christian nationalism, very large percentage of the population. Second, I thought it was very interesting that the KKK claimed to have 40,000 ministers that were preaching KKK values. But the moral majority then in the 80s and 90s claimed to have 72,000 preachers. And there again, the connection from the KKK having preachers that are preaching their message to the moral majority, a very similar movement, having preachers. So what I think this shows is these constant through lines. And I wondered if you all both could talk a little bit about how Christian nationalism as we see it today is connected to the ongoing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in America.
Let me quick, I just went over this with my students the other day because Jerry Falwell, he wrote it down. You know, he actually said things. And one of the things that he said was, if the Supreme Court was following God's word and listening to the Lord's will, they would never have decided Brown versus Board of Education. He believed that segregation was absolutely honoring a line of demarcation that God has established. And he said no good Christian who is black would ever support integration. And he went on to say, integration would destroy our race. It's very clear that Jerry Falwell was an absolute segregationist, and he promoted it from his pulpit. Bob Jones was even more so. Bob Jones Sr. is easy to pick on because also he wrote very influential pamphlets. He said that, of course, black people should have stayed in Africa. They should have remained in the jungle. He used the word jungle. But he said, but look what happened. The fact that they came to America means that they could become Christian. Now, what's interesting is that no white segregationist who somehow applauds black people who come to America to become Christian believes that they're the same kind of Christian as them. And so people like John MacArthur are very clear in saying that they do not honor the black church or black theology because it's wrong theology. And so they have it wrong. And therefore, all of the things that he speaks to and people like him speak to a white-oriented philosophy, a white-oriented theology. And when you start spilling this out over the centuries, what you see is that there is a clear racial hierarchy that is established in America. White people are clearly superior, and they put it in the textbooks. Black people are clearly inferior and always spoken of as just one moment away from the jungles of Africa as cannibals who sharpened their teeth. And somewhere in the middle were the yellow people. Within that, there's always a sense that the white people were to Christianize, and that Christianizing, civilizing mission meant they had the capacity to make them better people, but they will never become equal enough to participate as equals in the political sphere. So one of the things that you notice in documentaries like this, or anytime you actually watch them in their own settings, is the number of white men that appear, sometimes white women, but it is a white presumption that no one else will really be capable of sharing the stage because there's a suspicion that they still really haven't yet got it right. So political participation on the part of non-white people is suspect because they can't seem to ever get the politics right. Certainly not the one that honors what God's intended vote and policy would be.
Which is why it is imperative that we liberate ourselves from race and racist ideology and the systemic operation of it. So this is a personal story of mine. I grew up going to church, loved church, not evangelical church. I attended little small Black Baptist church in the community. I was sharing with my table, which our church was literally a offshoot or offspring of the church that my enslaved ancestors built or were segregated to, when they were enslaved. So they had a church. They were Black Moravians because they were enslaved by, are you familiar with Old Salem in Winston-Salem? Okay, so that's where my ancestors were enslaved. And so if you ever go there and there's the cabin, the slavery church. So at one point they were all in church together. The Moravians worshiped with their enslaved Africans. But then over time there was the pressure to segregate. So they sent them off to do church, church on their own. And so there's the Black Moravian church. And then the church that I grew up in is an offspring of that church. And so my family has, my ancestors, my family were a part of building the church and the community that I grew up in. And so as I watched this documentary, I'm like, wow, I was protected from all of this manipulation and conspiring, so yay for being marginalized. So by the time, but I have and had a heart for God, and I thought, okay, the best thing that I could do was to go to seminary or to become a theologian, and literally the Holy Spirit was like, nope, nopity, nope, which made no sense to me because I'm thinking, isn't this the best way to serve you? And over and over and over again, during my time as a graduate student, Holy Spirit, God was leading me to understand race, understand this construct, study it, so that you can detangle from it. And again, that's so imperative because race and the invention of it was the first conspiracy, right? The first conspiracy, the first conspiring of divide and conquer. And so, yes, Dr. Marti pointed out, when you look at the video, you see these silos and people segregated to themselves in their own silos. And that's dangerous. And that's how you get manipulated and shaken, because you're not around people who can show you Jesus through a different expression. So I like that comment when he goes, I think it's at the beginning, and the radio host is like, how are we better through diversity? And I'm like, well, let me tell you. Because if the radio host would have been my friend, or would have interacted with me or someone like me in a different community, you would not be being manipulated this way, because you would see a different version or you would see love, justice, and mercy walked out and lived out in community, right? But when you're in your own silo and, repeatedly told that the expression is about prosperity or, a very specific type of Christianity, and then that's all you see, then that's what you're left with. And so in this case, you're susceptible to this kind of conditioning without any kind of disruption, no way for a different perspective, to entertain a different perspective. So the through line is there from segregation. Race was invented to divide and conquer. People are conquering by using racial identity. In this case, they're calling it Christian nationalism.
Wow. I love that you use the language of conspiracy, because I think that really is a helpful theme for us as we try to process the rest of this documentary, building on what you've both said. Sometimes I'm susceptible, and I know others are because I hear them ask me questions about it, of imagining that what's happening is kind of just happening by happenstance, and what we're experiencing is sort of accidental, and that faith is just like slowly mutating into this Christian nationalism thing, sort of on its own, without any control. Nobody's really behind the scenes. It's like the Wizard of Oz. Faith is just changing, right, in America. But what the film shows, and I think what students of history like yourselves, scholars, can show us, is that this has been an intentional, calculated effort to take over America from a particular stance of religion, which many here would not agree with. And that there's so much going on behind the scenes that we don't see. So for instance, just by a show of hands, how many knew that the Council for National Policy was behind the moral majority, Reagan, Tea Party, and Trump? How many knew that that one group was responsible for all those? One person. One person in the room. Two people in the room, two or three. That's really important. So when you talk about conspiracy, there's the conspiracy. These are smart people in the room. People in this room are very smart. I know this because I'm the pastor to some of these folks. And we don't know. I didn't know that the Council for National Policy was behind all that for a long time. I just thought, oh, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson got together and were like, hey, let's build something together. I didn't even know who Paul Weyrich was until after I worked on a PhD. I didn't know Paul Weyrich's name. I'd never even heard it. So the conspiracy that's happening is very calculated and intentional, and I would like to kind of break some of that down. So let's start by talking about, if you will, a little bit about Paul Weyrich. Gerardo, why don't you start, and then let's reflect on Paul Weyrich and Paul Weyrich's legacy as the architect of Christian nationalism in America.
Well, so essentially, Paul Weyrich was a very active political mobilizer. And this was around the time when mailing and things like mail merge, if you remember using WordStar and Word a long time ago, mail merge was giving people the capacity to write letters and to create these databases by which they could target people across the United States. Weyrich was among the first to create these mass targeted mailings for these political purposes. And so he crafted a message. He also was very intentional at the notion of mobilization. And so it's taking a message, mobilizing it, and then finding these really intriguing means to target people directly for money as well as for their vote. And so Weyrich, for me, first becomes not so much a preacher, although he is very persuasive, and he wasn't a preacher, but I mean, he wasn't just a spokesperson, he was an organizer. And the way in which he organized and advocated fostered tools that the religious right were able to continue to perfect over time. And by the way, it's the same tools that were used by televangelists to also build their databases and their fundraising capacities, so that when you see people on television and you go, how do they afford this? It's because they crafted the same tools. So this is a time when these tools were being utilized specifically for political purposes, and then you start to see a connection between the religious spokespeople and the religious televangelists and megachurch pastors, as well as then the political operators operating not just at the national level, but at the school board level, state senators, other kinds of elected officials as well. So that Christianizing of the state was a bottom-up, targeted effort that then successfully created a normative sense of what it meant to vote or to participate in politics as a Christian.
I had never heard of that man till I watched this. But for me, learning about him felt very hopeful, because again, there is a person who is intentionally the puppeteer, and then no, people aren't hearing from the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
You see. And people aren't here, like, am I missing something? How come I'm not getting any kind of unction, nudge, anything to vote for Trump, or, I'm searching, like, somebody tell me. And I would wonder, especially when I started doing racial healing work out loud, and I'm talking about healing, right? I ain't even talking about confronting whiteness. I'm just talking about you see what I'm saying? Yeah. And the pushback was, that's leftist. I didn't know anything about that. I had to confer with my husband, who had more, he understood the language of white evangelical. He is white, by the way. I didn't grow up in that, so I was so confused. Like, why are people saying that? So I had to learn about that. How are people making this political? Like, this is healing from a conditioning, so that we can, this is Romans 12:2, so that we can align with God's mind. What are they talking about as leftists? And so, again, I was so confused about, why, and people would share the same, I'm like, they're reading this from somewhere. There's a copy-paste happening. And where is that? I'm not having access to that. And I'm a Christian. And where are they getting this? So to watch this and see, oh, Paul, okay. Paul. Yeah, that Paul did that.
Not the apostle. This other-
Right. And I didn't know. I was like, way rich. Why? Yeah, that sounds about right. Like,
Way rich.
Way
yeah.
rich. So that to see that, that again, it's intentional. It's a plan. It's a plot.
Yes.
And so that was, I think, very hopeful for me.
And I love that you brought the hope in there and the Holy Spirit. That's the experience I had growing up as an evangelical, to get to the point where I thought for a long time, people of faith, just one day the Spirit convicted their hearts that innocent unborn children were being slaughtered by the masses. And so they just felt compelled and decided, we are going to start a movement to end this horrific. I was a naive, young, ardent, religious, young evangelical kid being raised in an evangelical church. I'm like, yeah, the Spirit convicted their hearts. And so then one day I'm reading a book by Randall Ballmer, who was interviewed here, and he tells the story of Paul Weyrich coming to Jerry Falwell and coming to Pat Robertson and saying to them, they had a meeting. It wasn't described in here. They had a meeting and they wrote down all the wedge issues that they could use to divide America, create a voting bloc that would unite conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals into an angry movement. And they put all the issues down that they could possibly do. Race was one they discussed, obviously, because the reason they gathered, because they were mad about that segregation ruling that said that the schools that had tax-exempt status would no longer have it if they remained segregated. So they were very angry because they were ardent segregationists. And then they got into this room and they realized, well, it's the 1970s. We can't use race like we once used to be able to. So let's use, what could we do to bring conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals together? And they figured out that abortion was the key issue. At the time, Jerry Falwell was preaching for abortion because ardent segregationists loved the idea of poor and sometimes people of color aborting their children. They were all about that from a genetics perspective. They loved that. So this was not a moral issue for them. They chose this as a political wedge issue to build and galvanize a movement. Once I read that, it was like scales, right? Because as a kid, I thought this was all religious, biblical, moral, conviction of the heart, and now we're out in a movement together as people of faith, when in reality, they got in a room together with Republican strategists and came up with a plot, back to the conspiracy language, to try to take over America with this issue as the primary issue. Now, many of the people who follow in this don't know that history, don't know that story, don't know the conspiracy. And so when you talk to them, like the experience you're talking about, what do you mean you want to talk about racism? That's radical and leftist. Let's talk about abortion, right? Because that's been made into being the moral issue of our era from an evangelical perspective. And so there's this kind of conspiracy that Paul really kind of gets started. And segregation is the animating issue. So it really is race, back to the founding. But then it leads to abortion being the presenting issue, which makes it look like a moral movement that has nothing to do with racism, but it's built out of a racist and segregationist logic. But the thing that troubles me is how broad it is. I thought that 7 mountains section, all the 7 areas of society that they have built their own structure in, and how many different policy groups and think tanks that the Council for National Policy has created, and how the Koch brothers are involved and all their money in these many arms. Talk about what it was like for you to think through the architecture and organization of conservative Christian nationalism born from Weyrich's vision.
Well, there's a lot to say here. You know, this Seven Mountains thing is very, very popular, even if people don't know how to call it or don't name it that way. And there's a lot to say. The first thing that I want to quickly say is the first mountain is family. And I want to throw in this notion of family value politics. So abortion may be the moral issue, but it's grounded in a larger notion about what the family should be like. And of course, it's an idealized sense of the family. A father who's working, making decisions. Under the father is a mother, and if she doesn't have children yet, her goal and her intent is to become a mother, and then you have children, and it's a very clear hierarchy, and everybody's supposed to follow along, and all these things, and the world is well if you organize your family well, etc. So family value politics and the idealization of that is crucial. Of course, the thing is that so many of the political leaders that they embrace have no connection to the actual practice of the ideal family that they actually want to have. I mean, it's so common, it's cliche. But the other one that has drawn my attention so much is because I grew up in Southern California, so you can't be in Southern California and not be connected to the Hollywood industry in some way. And the Hollywood industry is full of Christians who want to conquer Hollywood and see Hollywood as a God-honoring place. And so being able to dedicate time in the media and to affect the media for these presumptions is huge. It's big money and big influence. And so if I were to make a quick dash between West Coast and East Coast on Christian nationalism, on the West Coast, you see a lot more people playing out Christian nationalist values in media. Whereas in the East Coast, it's more about doing politics and Washington. They're not disconnected, but you have much more organization and savvy behavior, hustling that occurs in the Hollywood media for those who see themselves as conquering one of those mountains on behalf of God. So the way in which this operates is really big, and the aesthetics that go into Christian nationalism for being able to create that sense of awe and excitement and look at what I'm a part of, and yes, this is the vision that we're a part of, I guarantee you Hollywood and Hollywood sensibilities are a part of crafting those feelings that then have influence in the smallest towns of rural America as well.
Yeah. So I was telling this story to my table earlier, is that, again, I did not grow up in an evangelical or white evangelical environment, and so, or church, or that version of Christianity. And so my experience, I think, with the Seven Mountains, well, I'll say, so then I married my husband, who is white, his father, a white pastor in a large evangelical church. And so when I say zero, I mean absolutely no connotation, no connection, no idea that Christian and Republican are synonymous. None. My whole entire life had never heard that. So this is what I'm saying. When we are in different places and people have segregated themselves, I have never heard that. So I marry into this evangelical tradition, and just in casual conversation, that comes up, that Christians are supposed to be Republicans, and vice versa. I burst out laughing. Because I didn't know, I literally did not know. So I burst out laughing, and then everybody looks at me. And at this time, I have a doctorate. My brain is all the way turned on. I'm a thinker, I'm a creative, I'm a problem solver. But yeah, in that moment, the expectation was that I was supposed to throw all of that away and set that aside and to embrace this particular notion. Well, it's fundamental for humans to belong. We want to feel like we want to belong. So I tried it on. I said, okay, let me try this on. And I even voted for Republican Republican Bush at that time. I tried on the Jesus who is the corporate guy who runs an industry, and the goal is this hierarchy of money, and so tithing is huge, is the most important thing. More important, and then if you can tithe, then all will go well for you. And if you do not tithe, see, that's why you're poor and broke and sick, even though there are tithers who are poor and broke and sick. So anyway, I tried all that on, and I was telling Dr. Marti at my table, so currently I am looking for a therapist to recover from that post-traumatic stress syndrome that occurred. Because no part of me liked it, so took it back off. But so then I will say, that's how this plays out in real life. Because again, as I am doing this work that is totally, I believe, is totally God inspired. Otherwise, why would I do such hard stuff, right? like totally God inspired. That yes, and I began to be hit not only with the leftist stuff, like that's leftist, what you're doing. Then that was the first time I experienced, somebody handed me the pamphlet with the 7 mountains on it. And this is a person, she was a teacher, she was an artist, this intelligent person who sat down across from another intelligent person who I use my brain and to explain this to me as if I was dumb. Yeah. And so that, again, in this kind of conditioning and in these silos is who gets to be human, who gets to be seen as the Christian on the hill, all 7 of them, and then who is not human. So that's
I love that you brought up money. I think there is a theme of money running through the film, and I always ask the question, I've kind of trained myself this way to ask, who benefits from this arrangement financially? Because that usually, what do they say, follow the money, you usually find out what's going on. As you looked at the architecture of this and all the different policy groups that are created, you mentioned the family, that's one big one, and that's actually, interestingly enough, the one that publishes the voter guide. Why is that? Because it's targeting families. But there's also the data mining and using that data to influence to the point where they can tell you how many people it takes to swing a county and how to cover them with 7 to 12 hits from the council's propaganda to make them vote in a particular way. So there's that arm. We've mentioned the entertainment arm and the groups that influence entertainment and media. And then there's I don't know what you would call it, but free enterprise, libertarian arm, the economic arm, which of course the Koch brothers are very key in, and the many different policy groups and think tanks that they have created as libertarian philanthropists is maybe one way to put it. Talk a little bit about what the economics of all this and who this benefits for all of us to be going down this road toward Christian nationalism.
Yeah. So I want to go back a little bit. Part of what happened when we entered into the American Union, creating the United States, they agreed that we would stop the slave trade in 1807 or something. Say 1807, 1809. Well, lo and behold, slave owners became slave breeders, and the number of enslaved persons grew dramatically in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s. No wonder there was such opposition to abolition, because property was growing beneath them, right? Because enslaved persons are not persons, they're property. And I think you may know, Confederate money had enslaved persons on them, because that is actually the hard currency. After the Civil War, you know that reparations were paid. Governments did pay reparations. It just didn't go to black people. Reparations were paid to slave owners, right? Because they were losing property. And the arguments for slavery were more forceful after the Civil War ended, because there was still this sense of like this was God's intended plan for prosperity built on the labor of Africans. It's written down. Read the secession arguments, the secession bills that were promoted. So you then enter into the latter part of the century in which all of these people came from overseas, and it created a panic. Immigration bills that were created in the 1920s, let alone the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was deliberately passed because Chinese workers were a threat to white workers. Chinese workers were thought of as being hardworking and too prosperous, and they were taking opportunity from white people, starting in California, which created the first and extraordinary racial ban of the United States in 1882. By the time you then get to the immigration bills of radically restricting, it is because of the fear that immigrants would come with their mental illness, with their criminality, and some of them, maybe they actually could work and were hard laborers. They were going to take the opportunity to fulfill the American dream away from white Americans. So money is laced through all of this, and it's Christianized in the early 20th century. So I hope you know, in God we trust was not a part of the original currency of the United States. It was a movement on the part of wealthy business people who lobbied the government and were able to put it on our money and in the halls of Congress in the 1950s. In God we trust was a distinctive effort on the part of wealthy white Christian men. And so all of these things related to race and money and politics are constantly intertwined in all of these really intriguing ways.
No, and that just circles back to what I was saying about tithing being the most important thing, because the goal was to build an empire. And so for me, that, for the first time, Jesus felt like a CEO, not like a savior or an expression of the divine. He's a CEO, and Jesus has a suit and tie on, and conducting business. And I do recall that being pushed and funneled, like this notion of Jesus being a CEO and a businessman, and how important the money part is. And so you're not tithing because you are authentically generous and have an access to give. You're tithing because it's our responsibility to look at money this way and to participate in building an empire. And then the visual, is a white man, a wealthy white man in a suit and tie.
That's right.
Yeah.
And real quick, just to say, like Dale Carnegie, Norman Vincent Peale, Donald Trump considers Norman Vincent Peale his pastor, Robert Schuller, a number of other people that then lead to what we might call prosperity teachers today. It was a deliberate attempt to draw in suburban, upwardly mobile, or upwardly aspiring white-collar men who wanted to have their home, they wanted to have their little family, they wanted to have things nice and neat, but just had huge anxiety about being able to succeed in an increasingly neoliberal world. If wealth was going to happen, they had to make it themselves. And they used every leverage they could, including affiliations, racially segregated affiliations, to be able to network together, find those opportunities, and then sometimes either hint or make explicit, I'm a Christian too, give your business to me. There were Christian yellow pages that were produced for a long time to be able to craft this molding of, again, religion, economics, business opportunity, all of it centered on wealth. That's how then you finally get to an affirmation of a Donald Trump as a person who has wealth and is doing it in the right way. because the idea of a free market economy is supposed to be the best, God's best way of having the economy set up. Now, of course, the state is involved in compromising all kinds of things in the workings of the market, but at every point in time, the leverage is to give to those who already have asset-based wealth so that they can continue to grow asset-based wealth. And that's reflected in the tax policies that we see. It's historically been true for almost a century, and we see it in the current voting for Trump or in the rhetoric of the Tea Party movement. So there's a lot there.
There's a wedding of religious conservatism and, I would say, corporate interest.
That's right.
And even wealth, the interest of the wealthy, come together. We saw that in how the council went after oil tycoons to bring them into the movement, to continue to fund this movement, making a deal, making a compromise. It's a similar deal that they then made with Trump.
That's right.
Right? These deals that they're making, it's never really about Christianity. It's always about power and money.
That's right.
And to think that Paul Weyrich, I thought he put it most succinctly in one line. He said, it doesn't matter what the minimum wage is.
Right.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what the minimum wage is if you don't have a godly country.
That's right.
Which is very strange given that Jesus talked about poor folks more than anything else. And that and a minimum wage is what determines the level of poverty in America very often because we're in a wage-based economy. So that disconnect between Jesus' teachings, which I think Barber becomes the prophet about over and over, and the disconnect of Jesus' concern for the poor and what American Christianity looks like when it weds itself to power and money is so stark.
Right.
Yeah, but and even King talked about that, right? The kind of the three. So it was racism, and then deregulated capitalism, and war. Is that right? Yeah. Like so again, we just see it over and over again. And I do want to point out, side note, that I think it's interesting the pattern of the Conservative Party to what is it? Well, to use entertainers. Mm-hmm. So we had Reagan. Now we have Trump. Use entertainers.
John Wayne.
Yeah, as tools. And I mean tools the both way. Tools.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I think that's a perfect segue to talking about how the Republican Party, as I've become more left-leaning in my own political thinking, I end up finding myself oftentimes in conversations where I think mistakenly blame the Republican Party for the problem. Right? And in this film, and I think the reality is that the Republican Party has been used, exploited, and then taken over. And to the point where it went from, okay, I think Reagan can be useful to us, right? To, I don't think he buys the same vision, so now we're gonna go in another direction, right? To, okay, we're losing now, so we're gonna go with the compromise with the Tea Party folks. At every stage, the GOP is really just, it's not even relevant to the council. And so, unless it's a tool for them. They don't mind taking it over. They don't mind destroying it, which they tried to do with the Tea Party. They don't mind destroying it like they've done with Trump. They don't care about the GOP. They only care about winning, and the GOP, so far as it exists, is only a tool for their larger aims. And so the problem is the council and that architecture that you saw of all their policy groups, not their really Republican Party, which really doesn't even exist the way it once did, right? It's not the same Republican Party of my childhood, even though there may have been problems with that too. And so now, though, and I think you see this evolution of how they've used the party to the point now where it used to be, well, we can use them, maybe they'll give us justices. Now the language is not just destroy the party, destroy government. Not just take over, destroy it so that we can take over. That's the new means to the end.
That's right.
And they're saying out loud the parts they used to never say, right? Destroy democracy. Who cares about democracy? I follow Jesus. Who cares about democracy? We're doing this. We're going to be a God-given. The will of the majority has taken over God's rule of America. So now they're saying the secret part out loud, we want to destroy democracy, we want to destroy the government, and then even amplifying it further, this is the scary part to me, and I think it was to some who told me during the movie, they're using the language of war.
All the time.
We are in a war, and it's good and evil. Liberals are Satan. Liberals are evil. We are good. We are godly. And when you start to use that language, the by all means necessary, which came up over and over and over again, we will do it by violence, we will do it by force. Talk to me about this process of how we've gotten from there to now, this point where they're trying to destroy the government itself.
Well, this is the most frightening aspect of it all, and the part that I think so many people find hard to swallow. They are not willing to accept that there's a sheer naked form of power that's being exercised, because they just have a hard time believing that their Christian brothers and friends or people that they've admired or churches that they've been a part of would be a part of this agenda. I think that one of the crucial changes that have happened over the decades is, if you look at Billy Graham and the revivals in the 50s, there was always an attempt to use revival as a means for America to become a more moral America. There was always a conservative Christianity that wanted a different kind of America, but they hoped that revival and evangelism and conversion would do it. It didn't work. There's a radical failure of revivalism among them. And so we enter into the 21st century where they say, we're giving up on moral persuasion. We're giving up on revival. We now simply need to take the tools, right, the positions, the levers of power, and simply now make it happen in a way that no one has to agree, because it's now legislated by law. The reason that we want to take the presidency is the perception that the presidency has a tremendous amount of power. And yes, it does. Arthur Schlesinger famously wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency. It was about how the presidency had expanded the scope of its power. Evangelicals and the radical right we're talking about Christian nationalisms no longer seek to persuade. They now believe that they need to attain the levers of power. And so Donald Trump becomes orthodox as a Christian. He's an Orthodox Christian, not because he holds the right beliefs, but because he's willing to fight for the things they want to fight for. It's not about faith, it's about what you're willing to fight for. And in terms of the Supreme Court, they know they can't change the law that quickly, but they can change how the law is interpreted. And so the conservative legal movement, also many years in the making, is now occupying seats in the Supreme Court where democracy, popular rule, and persuasion no longer matter, as long as you have the right person interpreting it with a particular frame. Then we can now have the country that we want, and no one has to agree.
I think that's how the rule of the minority.
That's right.
It was like we looked out, and Bachman, I think, says it perfectly. This will be the last election, she says, right? Which is both a prophecy and a terrifying reality. And she says because the white Christian Protestant majority of this country is gone and no longer can run. So the only way for us to stay in power is to enact the long-term plan, which has been to take over the Supreme Court, to take over the presidency, and also to take over Congress and the House of Representatives, and to instantiate so much policy that it takes another 50 to 100 years for any other group to carve us out of the changes they've made. And you can already see it, and we're feeling it with Roe v. Wade being overturned, affirmative action being overturned. We have no idea really what's on the docket for the court coming up that could be overturned, that has been part of our society. So they've actually achieved, this is the scary part now, we're looking at a at least 50-year-long plan that they put into action and achieved it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so now we're at this point where it feels like we're on the brink again with another election of if Trump wins, the whole court will be for another 50 years. Tell us about what the
Well,
long-term
and
consequences.
why is it that there's such a strong anti-immigrant sentiment?
Yeah.
It's shocking, the kinds of things that are said. It's not just about the Haitians in Springfield, which took so much attention from the debate. There's more. There's a recent report that came out from PRRI just a few weeks ago. White evangelicals are the most anti-immigrant religious group in America. By many measures, I mean, far and away. They, majority, agree we should stop immigration at the border, we should deport them, and even if it means the separation of family, even if kids are caged, even if violence, the majority of white evangelicals said they agree. They agree that this is what we need to do. The anti-immigrant sentiment is directly tied to the kind of power they think they're losing. And so they're using racist tropes and other things in order to convince people that these are subhuman people, as criminals, as eating pets. These are things that dehumanize and say we cannot have them be a part of our system. It doesn't matter whether they are legal or not. They are not like us. And they bring in different religions, they different kinds of people we don't know. They are not a part of the America we understand ourselves to be. And so the fight against immigration is also an act on the part of a minority who seeks to act and enforce majority rule in any way that they can.
So I had a question, because you talked about Franklin Graham and in the 50s and the... and
Billy Graham.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Billy Graham.
Yeah.
The Graham, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Billy Graham, and, advocating for a more moral America. And then, eventually it's like, okay, we're not going to get it this way. We have to get it by any means necessary, that kind of force. But there were other people during that time in the United States, right? Working to make America aligned with the ideals from her inception, right? So why not couple up, partner, co-create with those folks? Right. And because, again, it really has nothing to do with faith, right? It is the belief in a racial hierarchy and an economic identity at play. And so people posing as Christians, I'm going to just say it that way, but yeah, at the root of it is a belief in an erroneous idea about white superiority. Because if it really is about morality, then you would just join with the other people who are also advocating and marching and fighting for justice. But that's not what's happening.
No.
So again, it comes back to race. Can we
Yes,
please?
it does, it
Can
does.
we understand it? Can we understand the original conspiracy? Because without that foundation, you were set up to fall for the okie doke over and over and over again. And now here we are with a Christian nationalism, which really isn't Christian nationalism. It is
Exactly.
a different version of white supremacy, KKK.
Yes,
So the
yes.
through line is there.
And I think these are linked, right? The economics and the racial are linked from the beginning. Stuart Hall, a philosopher, says that race is just the way that class plays out in American society. And so linking them forever is really important, and remembering that they're always playing off of each other. And so I think the reason that, first, we have to kind of acknowledge that the white Christian nationalist movement is not just a white dominant movement, but it's a rich people's movement. And you talk about rich people's movements throughout history in your book, which is something we don't hear about a lot. We know that there have been poor people's movements in America to try to get rights and privileges and marginalized groups fighting for rights. But there's also been rich people movements throughout American history as well to reassert power and dominance of the propertied elite. And this is just another rich people's movement, maybe one of the most powerful ones.
Absolutely.
And the reason you don't partner with a Martin Luther King if you're in a rich people's movement is because Martin Luther King also wants to get a higher living wage. And a higher living wage means less profits for the rich propertied class.
That's right. That's right.
You know, it's not just about we hate black people.
Right. Right.
It's also we hate poor people.
Right.
Right?
We want to be able to, we want to, without question or without regulation, we want to be able to exploit
Yes.
people.
Yeah.
We don't care what color you are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You just want
exactly.
to exploit your
Land,
labor.
people, resources,
That's it.
exactly,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
And also remember that the Supreme Court decision that declared corporations were people,
Yes.
and therefore could contribute to political campaigns becomes crucial here, because individual donations cannot compete with the level of corporate wealth, and we can guess at what their priorities might be.
100%. I want to leave some time for questions from our folks who are here. But one last question before we turn to that. We're in a progressive church community here. This is Myers Park Baptist Church. We're hosting this conversation. What is the role of progressive people of faith, not just Christians, but progressive people of faith in America and progressive Christian churches like ours in this world of Christian nationalism? What is our role? What should we be doing?
Wow. Well, that's also a $64 question, you know. One, I think, is much of the effort that I see here is an attempt to unbrainwash so much of what most people have grown up as the Christian way to think and do. Because I think that part of the struggle is that there are so many books, so many ministries, so many things that have institutionalized, colleges and universities and private schools that have said, this is the way to be Christian. You can live your whole life in that and never have a question that it could be different. The thing that I believe that I've been deprived of, I've been a Christian for most of my life, right? And I've been a pretty dedicated person to try to figure out my faith, and I read everything that somebody says, here, read this. But I was way along as a person before I was introduced to different theologies, different alternative visions, different ways, different histories. So I don't blame a lot of people for not being able to see any differently, because we can only think about the things that have been given to us to think about. And I think that churches like Myers Park offer a different way, which is hard, which makes you a target, which, you know, creates uncomfortable conversations with people who are friends and family, because you dare to think that maybe there might be another way, and there is. But I feel like that's a lot of the effort, because then it's being able to be a person who sees a little differently, who can somehow trace things in a truer fashion and be able to then have the difficult conversations in circles of trust. Because they may not hear it from you or from the liberal or from the socialist or the communist, whatever, that they believe is off track, but they may be willing to listen to someone that they grew up with, someone that they see their integrity and their faith. And so it's up to us also to spend time in the communities and the circles of influence that we have to try to work through that. But I'd say that so often the journey starts with our changing first.
Thank you.
That's what I was going to say. I had to hold on to the seat because I want to jump up and start shouting. Like, yes, preach, absolutely. And yes, you said it. We have to detangle from the conditioning of, okay, this is what, Christianity looks like, and be very intentional about, even in our prayers, okay, God, Jesus, What does this need to look like? And God is faithful and will answer. Seriously. But again, we don't even think to ask that question. We're just, doing what we're told. So I would just only add to that, be audacious. Be audacious and to actually function in our own power, like in our divine power. I watched this and I'm like, Paul Weyrich did not ask permission. He just boldly and audaciously, is walking in, his own rights, his resources, his talent, his skill. He is using all of himself to create this. Why can't we do that now? Not in a nefarious way, of course, in a dangerous way, but we can do that to co-create the just world that we definitely know that is possible. And yes, it starts with us. We cannot create out here what we have not embodied here. So we do this work first, because there's nothing more dangerous than somebody who has not done the work here. And so then they're performing it out here. And if you do that, you won't have roots. So then the wind will blow, and then you get knocked down, and then you're sitting in the corner rocking back and forth. So we want to, yes, that we, again, audaciously, and we have access to resources. We have access to the divine. And so we want to walk intentionally, purposely, out loud. My shirt says at the bottom, the whole shirt says, may we be people of peace with voices of hope, like literal voices, doing the hard work of love. And love shouldn't be hard, but the hard is there to denote action and intention. So you don't think it's just love like, I just love everybody. Not the feeling, but the actual work, the resisting this stream, the turning on your brain, the being intentional about educating, the being intentional about being introspective and reflective and contemplative, to the rewiring, the putting yourself around people that are different than you are, who think differently than you are. Like Dr. Marti, okay, I'm going to read a different theologian. Okay, so maybe this word biblical, and I wanted to share, but even that, that word makes me want to vomit, honestly. Yes. Causes a visceral reaction in me. Because it was created to, as a tool of manipulation. So just like we have during the time when they were saying, okay, this is what knowledge is, and so we have this canon of knowledge, then the theologians wanted to have something like that too. Well, we want to have something like that. So then, they created this, here's this way, and this is what is quote unquote biblical. So may we throw that away, may we question, may we detangle, may we deconstruct, may we actually go beyond growing, may we expand, may we reach for what is possible through, the God for which nothing is impossible. I think sometimes we just lay down and take it, but we don't have to. And we are not an army fighting. We have taken our guns and our swords and beat them into gardening tools. And we are planting seeds, and we are watering, and we are nurturing. That's the energy we are functioning in. Okay, I'm done.
Amen, Leslie. That's all right. Thank you both. Amazing. We've got a mic right here. Make sure it's turned on. It should have a green light on it if it is. And let's have some folks come. It's turned on. And just say your name and go ahead with your question.
I'm David Ziso. I think it is important what words we use when we describe the topic. My feeling is that we're looking at the position of what is moral. And in that way, I think about, and we also looked at what it means to be Christian and the misuse of the word Christian. When it was spoken by the three people up front here about Christian heritage, my concern is that the that is the current use of the word. And 20 years ago, it would be talked about as the Judeo-Christian understanding. And I think the lack of saying Judeo-Christian, we really miss a powerful word, because what it does in that saying is bring in another group to show that it is not unique, but it is shared. And then there is another word that comes to my mind, and that is when we talk about the 1%, the really wealthy. And I've run across a term that has a different definition. It's called the obscenely wealthy. And I think that that would be a good phrase to put in one's conversation, because it would raise thoughts in the person to say, ooh, I didn't think about it that way.
Thank you, David. One thing about the Judeo-Christian constellation is, on the one hand, it can be helpful, to David's point, that it can deconstruct this idea of Christian supremacy, that there are other traditions that hold it. But on the other hand, this Judeo-Christian constellation is very much present in the feelings about what's going on in Israel right now. And so we may need Abrahamic instead of just Judeo-Christian, because without the Muslim third part, we end up with a political agreement about genocide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to quickly say, I think I agree and understand your intent, David. The research recently on tracing Judeo-Christian as a term has shown its conservatism, and that it has been co-opted in a way that actually builds and fosters conservative agendas. And so it's been real tricky as the religious studies people have tried to decode this over and over again. They see problematic use of that in the way it's actually been done. I don't think it's what you mean, by the way. I think that you're saying something quite different. But if we look at it in a political atmosphere and attempt to understand it in relation to Christian nationalism, it ends up taking on a different thing, a pretension towards diversity and broad-mindedness that actually does not exist when you actually look at their actions and behaviors. That's it. Thank you.
Is there another question?
I'm Beth Walters. What can we do? Volunteer at Mecklenburg County Democrats. It's a great thing to do. A question. A couple of decades ago, I learned the premise that change leads to fear, and fear leads to anger. And what's always behind anger is wanting to say, no, wait a minute, I'm in power here, or we're the ones in power here. And of course, as Jesus was, quote, told in the wilderness when he was waiting, the three great motivators for sin are power, prestige, and possessions. So I'm wondering if it does, how does that apply in the situation here?
It's a fantastic question, yeah.
Well, I mean, Beth.
And when you're through, I need to tell you where that premise came from.
I just 100% agree, which every time I've talked with Beth, I think I find myself pretty much 100% agreeing with you on things, but I think that you're very much right there. Obviously, one of the things that's interesting, now my draw is from Max Weber, who described different levels by which people attain power. And we have a case where people can use money in order to attain influential positions of power as well as prestige. But people who have prestige can also leverage that to get money and to get power. So these things can work in a lot of different ways. And what we find is there is nobody seems to be happy only having one. If you are phenomenally wealthy, you also want to be influential. And if you're influential, you actually want to be able to have power to make decisions. So the interplay is a constant sense of building off of one another. What we find from the first Trump presidency is that people were offered opportunities for levers of power that had been denied to them before. They may have had wealth, and they may have even had some influence, like Paula White, but they did not have power in terms of political leverage power, decision-making power. They used that Trump presidency as a base to grow the other bases of power, creating organizations, networking with each other, and building closer tie among allied organizations. That's why when Project 2025 came out, it was so shocking because it revealed the extent of the planning that has been taking place and the amount of power that's already been accumulated so that they are ready to go once the new election happens. Before they were figuring it out and organizing themselves, that organization has mostly been successful and fruitful. They are ready to run when the next thing happens. And that's that interplay of the three that I see. Yeah. She said she wanted to follow.
That premise, by the way, comes from Star Wars. And also, I would ask,
I love
would you talk briefly about the papal doctrine of discovery that goes back to the 4th century? Because I think it is echoing in what we're talking about. Because it has the religious, it has the racism, and it has the power.
Listen, we're not going to do a full lecture here, but I was just in my class the other day talking about the Pope dividing the world in two, and that division of the world essentially taking the two most powerful Christian powers of the day, Spain and Portugal, and like two kids who want the same toy, the Pope said, let's separate you two, and that way you can have this and you can have this. The Portuguese innovated the slave trade. The Spaniards took over most of the New World, and together they created what was intended to be a newly Christian America. But of course, because these are pagans, because they are not Christian, they are at war, and unless they convert, then they are people who can be killed, slaughtered, or enslaved, because we are going to build a Christian world. And my medievalist friend put it in a very nice way, who said, all of the failures of the Crusades, all of the attempt to take the Holy Land, all of the intent that they had for what they wanted to do in taking over Jerusalem and those lands were utterly unfulfilled, but they took all those hopes and dreams and immediately transferred it to the New World. And so the same intent of conquest and Christianizing was embedded in that, and of course, the papal doctrines all paved the way for that in a legal, justifying sense.
Those doctrines, yes, still are referred to by the Supreme Court.
That's right.
Yes.
Still at play, still at work.
Thank y'all for this conversation. I'm Cindy Adcock, and I have friends who go to Black evangelical churches, and they tell me about the frustration they have to get their pastors to talk anything about politics, which of course is the exact opposite of what we are seeing with white nationalists. So I am curious in my mind, what, if any, relationship is there between white evangelicals and Black evangelicals?
Do you have a sense of that? I have my guess.
Well, okay, we'll give your.
go ahead.
Well, no, I just, I would imagine that, yes, in a Black evangelical church, the politics aren't used that way. And politics and faith are not synonymous in the way that it is here being used here. So I would imagine that the focus is on salvation, you being able to pay your bills, you being able to not be sick. So the fundamental, the fundamentals of life, and and then your connection to God, your salvation, your relationship, and then how that carries throughout the day. That's just kind of my guess. And for example, so if there were an organized movement, so you think back civil rights in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the black churches were the places, were the education centers and the places where people were organized. And that is in the midst of a very active and notable movement. And I think right now there is not that level of organization that is happening. And so perhaps that is why there is no conversation or very little conversation in the way that it was in the time of Martin Luther King.
Right.
That's just,
I'm sure you have something to add. Real quick, I would say churches overall are struggling. We know that we are living in an era of church decline. Black churches are also largely not robust. That means that at every moment that they move away from either the immediacy of pastoral need or a more general sense of what it means to feel like you're connected to God and can inspire people to be connected to God, everything else is a field full of landmines. It is something that's potentially divisive, it pulls people away, and it will hurt especially those that they can't seem to attract and keep, which is younger black people. And so politics is dangerous. Now, of course, a lot of white evangelical churches also say they avoid politics. But among the black church, the propensity lies more towards prosperity, not with everyone, but a lot of research shows that the propensity towards prosperity, which again, individual, personal traumas and difficulties met on a pastoral level, or the attempt to inspire on a grander vision, but the concrete messiness of politics is too dangerous for tithes, for attracting membership, for keeping membership.
yeah, survival is the fundamental message.
Which is antithetical to the gospel, because Jesus said that survival is not the goal at all, right? It is death to self, right? And so it's the opposite of sustainability. And so the problem with this very idea of saying we're not going to say this thing that's prophetic because it might destroy the organization is in fact the opposite of what Jesus taught. And also it's fundamentally impossible. There's no way to actually be apolitical because avoiding political issues is simply just an affirmation of the current horrific reality. Every time you don't say something, you are confirming that you agree. It's agreement with the way the world is. And so do we want to just keep, every time we don't talk about it, we're just saying we agree. We're good with Palestinian children dying. We're good with people of color not being able to have access to the same rights and privileges everybody else have. We're good with transgender people being targeted. We're good with all that. Every time we don't speak, we are affirming the status quo. And because there's no real actual way to be apolitical. It's not real. So, but it is a very good way to raise money, to not say anything political. And so that's why Elevation is the size that Elevation is, because you will not get them to say something on an issue, right or left. Even though they're the largest contributor to the Southern Baptists in North Carolina, you will not get them to stand on an issue because they know that to avoid it means more dollars.
Right, and just at least from the video, the Patriot Church pastor who says, there are some people who are destroying property, but those weren't Christians, right? I'm there to stand. I'm there to stand. So they also pretend that somehow they were not being political, which is odd. So this stance is something that is so difficult that in the mindset of many people who are very conservative in their politics and vote that way and act that way, they believe that they are not being political. And that's why you have these signs, Jesus saves, and all these things, because they believe that in their minds, it's really a religious act, an act of faith, not a political act.
Yes. Lunch is here. We have time for one more question. Lauren?
Hi, I'm Lauren Horton. Ironically, I actually used to go to church with Dr. Barry and Dr. Marty, so this is fun being here in this space with y'all. So I loved what y'all said about how if we're in different spaces, we have different points of view. And as a New Yorker raised by evangelical parents who were extremely progressive and Democrat, and I worked in Harlem for a politician, came down here, I have the extreme privilege of being in different spaces. In one area where, and so therefore how I voted was always reflective upon that. But one area coming from that background was around my LGBTQ family members, and that was always this kind of like, well, it was a messy space, and it's taken me a lot of time to deconstruct and get where I am today. And so I wanted to ask you, because we're Myers Park Baptist Church, and this is why I'm here, actually came from Elevation. We did not all go to Elevation. I went to Elevation after, but being completely transparent, I did, and this is one of the reasons it brought me here. Can you talk a little bit about where the conservative Christian voices have gotten so loud around the LGBT community? We've seen, since last year alone, more than 220 anti-LGBTQ bills going into state legislatures. More than 70 have passed and been enacted. And the day after Biden was inaugurated, I remember seeing Sean Fuchs, and if those of you who don't know him, he's very prophetic. He was one of the ones doing the Christian rallies at locations after George Floyd was murdered, and he had his worship guitar. And I saw a glimpse of him going live on social media with thousands watching him. And the only thing he talked about when we had minimum wage issues going on and global issues in the start of pandemic, the only thing he talked about was transgender policy and what we have to do. So one thing. And I was like, where did we get to this point that now this is even louder than everything I had seen before? So was there a specific moment where that became kind of like, okay, now we're going to rally around this. We did abortion, but now this is it. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then what we can do as a collective body here and others to continue to advocate within our Christian circles?
No, I was just thinking, I remember when it was chosen to be an issue, and it was during Bush the son, and intentionally chosen because you have to have it. It's one thing to continue to say it's us against them. It's us against them. We have an enemy. I like how they had that like red dude who was like the devil hovering. So okay, that's a common narrative, and so it's not popular to paint the devil and the enemy as African Americans or Black people anymore. So we got to find a new scary person. So it's the immigrant, and it's people. It's our LGBTQIA brothers and sisters. But so I remember it happening, but I think you can speak more specifically to the strategy. Yeah.
Well, there's not just one way to understand it, but the way I would trace it back is there's such a consistency about gender issues. To me, it ties it broadly into family value politics, what I call family value politics. So we know that women have been resisted as people who could have legitimate power, that they could live by themselves, that they could manage their own bank accounts, that they could have the vote. I mean, this is a very, very long. By the time the 1960s came, the gender rights, civil rights, and homosexual rights were intertwined. All of them seen as...
It's a reaction to the 60s.
Yeah, all of them seen as radical and destructive elements. That's why they say the America's being destroyed. We've not won. All those things were combined. As we then start to move religiously, Christian bodies began to accept women as pastors, and that was huge. But that took a while. And then could you have same-sex marriages? Could you have gay and trans, wasn't really a talk at that time, gay and trans people who were members? Could they even be members, let alone serve in leadership? And then be pastors? Can you ordain them? So then then it's like, okay, wait, now we have these books. Now, do we teach our children? How do we teach our children about sexuality? So decades ago, the only question was, do we talk about condoms or not? Now it's, do we talk about gender identity? And that is a bridge that went too far. So I believe that the book banning and the agitation of parents wanting to protect their children is a radical extension of the gender politics that we've lived with in America for a very long time. But we're naming it in particular ways, and that's now so difficult because all of us are having to think new thoughts. And it's very uncomfortable to think new thoughts. And so those who say, well, of course these are new because that's just not the way it's supposed to be. And then you tie into that, and between familiarity and tradition and all these other argumentations, then I think the majority of Americans start to move. Even though the majority of Americans are supportive of a same-sex marriage and they're supportive, when you start talking about kids, people become a lot more conservative. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect history. One thing just to connect some dots for folks, homophobia, which is the word we hear a lot being used, is born of a thing we call heteropatriarchy. And one way it was put to me early on that's helped me understand where this all comes from is that homophobia is at its base the hatred of women, which then leads you to hate men who are not acting like men and women who are not acting like women in the traditional roles. All of that is born of the hatred of women at its base. And so it's born out of a deeply patriarchal which is tied to this traditional family values, gender roles, what men are supposed to do, what women are supposed to do. And so it's all linked together with the rights and privileges afforded to women post-1960s, which of course there was also an LGBTQ movement in the 60s and a movement about race in the 60s. All of modern conservatism is still a reaction to those advances of the 1960s, and we see that continue to play out. Yeah. Well, let's thank our panel for all their amazing pieces of wisdom and nuggets. Thank you so much.